For weeks, Las Vegas baked under some of the most relentless heat the city has ever recorded. Now that heat is finally breaking. But scientists studying exactly how it's breaking say the collapse itself might be more dangerous than the heat wave that came before it. It sounds almost counterintuitive. A city spends weeks under punishing, record-challenging temperatures, and the moment relief finally arrives, researchers start sounding more concerned rather than less. Understanding why requires looking at exactly what happens to a desert landscape after it's been baked for weeks on end, and exactly what tends to follow immediately after. This summer has been a genuinely brutal one for southern Nevada. Las Vegas recorded its hottest day of the year on August 1st, with Harry Reid International Airport hitting 115 degrees, just 1 degree short of the all-time record set back in 1979 and 1938. That came on the heels of an already exhausting July, the third warmest ever recorded in the city, averaging 96.6 degrees with barely a trace of rain. By the middle of August, an extreme heat watch had gone back into effect across the valley, with the most intense temperatures expected to peak midweek before finally giving way to storm chances by the weekend. That pattern, days of oppressive, record-challenging heat followed by an abrupt shift toward thunderstorms, has repeated itself again and again across Las Vegas this summer, almost like clockwork. Tracking the full sequence makes the pattern even clearer. The valley recorded its first 110-degree day of the year back on July 8th. And by the time July ended, Harry Reid International Airport had logged 12 separate days at or above that threshold, close to the annual average of 10. An extreme heat warning issued in late July stretched on for 10 straight days as it was extended repeatedly, only easing briefly before another round built right back in during the first week of August, then again in mid-August, each cycle following a nearly identical script. As of Wednesday, county officials had already confirmed 46 heat-related deaths across Clark County this year, with victims ranging in age from 28 to 87. That number reflects only confirmed cases processed so far, and public health officials have acknowledged the true toll from a summer this relentless likely won't be fully known for months. Once every pending case has been reviewed, the heat has disrupted far more than daily comfort too. On the valley's hottest days, thinner desert air combined with extreme temperatures has forced airlines to implement weight restrictions on outbound flights. Since hot, thin air reduces how much lift an aircraft can generate during takeoff. During one particularly brutal stretch, more than 450 flights were delayed at Harry Reid International Airport as crews worked to keep planes light enough to safely leave the ground, with some travelers offered thousands of dollars to voluntarily give up their seats. The underlying physics behind that disruption comes down to what concept aviation professionals call density altitude, essentially how thin the air actually is once temperature and elevation are both factored in together. Hot air is less dense than cool air, and Las Vegas's elevated desert location only compounds the effect further, meaning on the hottest days, the air an aircraft's wings and engines have to work with can behave as though the airport sits thousands of feet higher than it actually does, directly reducing how much weight a plane can safely carry into the sky. If you're finding this kind of grounded, source-based weather coverage useful, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this reach more people who want to understand what's actually happening instead of just reading a scary headline. So what does it actually mean when meteorologists describe a heat wave like this one as collapsing? It doesn't mean the heat simply fades away gradually. It means the specific high-pressure ridge responsible for trapping that heat in place finally breaks down, typically replaced by an influx of monsoonal moisture that brings clouds, humidity, and often sudden intense thunderstorms to a landscape that spent weeks baking under clear skies and triple-digit sun. That collapse happened in dramatic fashion in mid-August, when a wave of monsoonal moisture finally pushed through the Las Vegas Valley after roughly 2 full weeks of extreme heat. Harry Reid International Airport recorded measurable rainfall for the first time in nearly 2 months, a genuine relief after a rainless stretch that had left the ground bone dry across the entire region. The rain arrived over several consecutive days in mid-August, with football games canceled due to inclement weather and neighborhoods across the valley finally seeing meaningful precipitation for the first time in weeks. Temperatures dropped well below the seasonal normal of 103 degrees during that stretch, offering the valley its first genuinely comfortable string of days since early summer. But that same storm activity carried real immediate danger too. The National Weather Service issued flash flood warnings across central Clark County and into northwestern Arizona, describing life-threatening flash flooding as thunderstorms dumped up to 1.5 inches of rain in a matter of hours, over ground that had spent weeks with virtually no rainfall at all. Roads near Nelson, Hoover Dam, and Willow Beach were specifically flagged as areas likely to flood, with officials repeating the now familiar warning to turn around rather than drive into flooded roadways. Flood advisories stretched across multiple parts of the valley during that same stretch, including the southwest communities of Mountain's Edge, Spring Valley, Blue Diamond, and Enterprise. along with more rural areas like Searchlight and Coyote Springs further from the urban core. That breadth illustrates just how widely a single storm system's flooding impact can spread once it moves across ground that's thoroughly dried out by weeks of extreme heat. This is precisely the pattern scientists say deserves real concern, not because any single storm is unusual, but because of how consistently and how severely Las Vegas has been swinging between two extremes this year: weeks of dangerous, parching heat followed abruptly by intense, flood-producing storms, with almost no gradual transition in between. That absence of a gentle in-between phase is itself part of what makes this pattern so difficult for both infrastructure and residents to adapt to. Meteorologists have a term for this kind of abrupt swing between extreme conditions. They call it weather whiplash, and it's becoming an increasingly common feature of how climate change is reshaping precipitation and temperature patterns across the American Southwest. Instead of steady, predictable seasonal transitions, regions like southern Nevada are increasingly experiencing long stretches of one extreme condition followed by a sudden, intense swing to the opposite extreme. Genuinely life-threatening flooding within just a matter of minutes, catching residents off guard precisely because heat, not flooding, dominates most people's mental image of Las Vegas weather risk. The physical reason flash flooding becomes especially dangerous after a prolonged heat wave comes down to what happens to soil during extended dry, hot conditions. Desert ground that's baked under intense heat for weeks develops what soil scientists call hydrophobicity, essentially a crusted, water-repellent surface layer that forms when organic material in the topsoil breaks down under extreme heat and effectively seals the ground against absorbing new moisture. That means when rain finally does arrive, after a long, hot, dry spell, instead of soaking into the parched earth the way it normally would, the water simply runs off the hardened surface almost immediately, funneling rapidly into washes, streets, and low-lying areas rather than gradually recharging groundwater the way healthier, more porous soil would. This is exactly why flash flooding tends to hit hardest immediately following rather than during a region's most extreme heat events. Scientists studying soil hydrophobicity have found the effect can persist for weeks after the underlying heat event itself has passed, meaning even storms arriving well after a heat wave officially ends can still trigger disproportionately severe runoff and flooding compared to an identical storm falling on soil that had time to gradually recover its normal absorption capacity. That lingering vulnerability is part of why flood risk in a region like the Mojave Desert doesn't simply reset the moment temperatures cool back down. Las Vegas's own topography makes this dynamic particularly dangerous. The valley sits surrounded by mountains and higher terrain, including the Spring Mountains and Sheep Range, which funnel rainwater rapidly downhill into the urbanized valley floor below. Officials with the Clark County Regional Flood Control District have repeatedly emphasized that a single intense thunderstorm can produce life-threatening flooding within minutes, even when the broader forecast for the day looked relatively mild. Since the district's establishment back in 1986, more than $2.5 billion has been invested in flood control infrastructure across Clark County, including 722 miles of storm drains, channels, and washes, along with 113 completed detention basins designed specifically to capture and slow floodwater before it can overwhelm residential and commercial areas. Officials describe this infrastructure investment as decades of foresight paying off, even as the underlying weather patterns it was designed to handle appear to be intensifying. More than 10 additional flood control projects, representing over $114 million in new investment, remain under construction across the valley right now, spanning areas both east and west of Interstate 15 along the Charleston corridor, along with newer projects in Henderson and the Northwest Valley. Officials have been candid that these investments can reduce the risk of damage and loss of life, but cannot eliminate flooding entirely in a landscape this naturally prone to sudden, intense runoff. Local firefighting agencies have taken the flash flood threat seriously enough to run dedicated, swift water rescue training ahead of monsoon season, specifically because of how quickly conditions can turn dangerous. Henderson firefighters, for example, have spent time this year specifically preparing crews for water rescues, with officials publicly warning residents never to underestimate how quickly a seemingly shallow flow of moving water can sweep a person or a vehicle away. Emergency officials point to a sobering statistic every monsoon season to underscore that exact warning, that most flood-related deaths nationwide occur inside vehicles, when drivers underestimate how little water it actually takes to lift and carry a car off the road entirely. Just 6 inches of moving water can knock an adult off their feet, and roughly 1.5 feet is enough to float most vehicles, numbers officials repeat constantly precisely, because that gap between how dangerous flowing water actually is and how dangerous it looks tends to catch people off guard. The The National Weather Service's lead forecaster in Las Vegas has been direct about this dynamic in public briefings throughout the season, noting that while extreme heat certainly represents the region's biggest and most persistent weather hazard, a single seemingly ordinary thunderstorm can produce Gene. There's also a broader climate signal tied directly into why this year's monsoon season has carried elevated flash flood risk in the first place. Emergency officials in the Las Vegas Valley specifically flagged the developing El Niño pattern as a factor likely to boost monsoon storm intensity across the region this summer, months before the season's most intense flooding actually arrived. That connection matters, because the same historically strong El Niño event currently building across the Pacific, one federal forecasters now believe has a real chance of becoming the strongest ever officially recorded, tends to shift moisture patterns across the Southwest in ways that can intensify individual storm events, even while broader seasonal totals remain within a more typical range. A stronger, wetter monsoon storm arriving on top of heat-hardened ground is exactly the combination flood control officials have been bracing for all summer. The National Weather Service's own lead forecaster in Las Vegas described this year's monsoon setup ahead of the season as unusually active compared to recent years, citing a combination of favorable atmospheric factors working together. That early assessment has largely held up, with the valley experiencing more sustained rounds of monsoon moisture and correspondingly more flash flood warnings than several of the drier monsoon seasons the region experienced earlier in the decade. What makes this pattern especially concerning to scientists studying it isn't just this particular collapse in mid-August. It's what typically comes immediately afterward. According to AccuWeather's long-range forecasting team, the same high-pressure ridge responsible for this summer's repeated heat waves across the West is expected to rebuild and expand westward again from late August into early September, potentially suppressing the very monsoon activity that just provided this brief window of relief. That forecast lines up almost precisely with the pattern Las Vegas has already lived through multiple times this summer. A ridge builds, temperatures climb toward the extreme range for anywhere between 1 and 2 weeks. Moisture eventually breaks the pattern and brings a mix of relief and flood risk. And then within days to roughly a week, the entire cycle begins building back toward its next peak. Forecasters tracking this rhythm describe it as one of the more persistent patterns they've documented in recent memory for this particular region. That means the pattern Las Vegas has now experienced repeatedly throughout the summer, extreme heat, followed by a brief flood-prone collapse, followed by renewed heat building right back in behind it, appears likely to repeat itself once again in the very near future. Each cycle compounds the risks of the one before it, hardening soil further during the heat phase and then testing already strained flood infrastructure once storms return. Death Valley, sitting within driving distance of Las Vegas and sharing much of the same broader desert climate system, offers a stark preview of just how extreme this underlying heat pattern has become this year. Furnace Creek in Death Valley National Park has repeatedly climbed above 120 degrees during the same stretches that pushed Las Vegas past 115, underscoring just how widespread and consistent this summer's heat has been across the entire Mojave Desert region, not just within the city limits of Las Vegas itself. Overnight temperatures have proven just as concerning to public health officials, tracking this pattern as daytime highs. During several of this summer's most intense heat events, overnight lows across the Las Vegas Valley failed to drop below 90 degrees in many areas, compared to a typical overnight low closer to 83. That lack of nighttime cooling matters enormously for public health, since the human body relies on that overnight temperature drop to recover before the next day's heat begins building again. Meteorologists specifically flagged those elevated overnight lows as the bigger concern during several of this summer's heat events, rather than the daytime highs themselves, since consecutive nights without any real relief compound heat stress on the body in ways that a single scorching afternoon alone doesn't. Vulnerable populations, particularly the elderly and those without reliable access to air conditioning, face the greatest risk during exactly this kind of sustained, round-the-clock heat exposure. Medical professionals treating heat-related illness across southern Nevada have echoed that same concern throughout the summer, noting that patients presenting with heat exhaustion and heat stroke symptoms have often gone multiple consecutive nights without any meaningful cool down before their bodies finally reached a breaking point. Community Ambulance, one of the region's emergency medical providers, logged well over 100 heat exposure emergency responses in a single month during the peak of this summer's heat, a pace local officials described as consistent with some of the most demanding stretches they've handled in recent memory. Clark County has responded by repeatedly activating emergency cooling stations across Las Vegas, North Las Vegas, Henderson, Boulder City, Laughlin, and Mesquite throughout the summer, offering daytime shelter at community centers, libraries, and other public facilities. Despite that outreach, surveys conducted by the Desert Research Institute's Nevada Heat Lab found that roughly half of Nevadans surveyed didn't even know these cooling stations existed in the first place. A genuine gap in public awareness that officials are actively working to close as the pattern continues. That awareness gap carries real consequences, given how many of this year's confirmed heat deaths have involved people without reliable access to air conditioning at home. Several of the county's cooling stations are specifically equipped to accommodate pets on a leash or in a carrier, a detail officials have highlighted repeatedly, since some residents have historically avoided seeking shelter rather than leave a pet behind in dangerous heat. The broader context surrounding this summer only reinforces how significant this pattern has become. The contiguous United States endured its second hottest first half of any year on record in 2026, according to the National Centers for Environmental Information, with July alone setting a new record as the hottest month ever measured across the country. Las Vegas's own experienced this summer extreme heat waves punctuated by dangerous flash flooding fit squarely within that much larger national pattern rather than standing apart from it as an isolated regional story. Other desert communities across the Southwest have documented remarkably similar whiplash patterns of their own this year, from Phoenix to Death Valley to smaller communities scattered across the Mojave and Sonoran deserts, suggesting this isn't a quirk, unique to Las Vegas's particular geography, but rather a regional signature of how this summer's broader atmospheric pattern has interacted with desert terrain across an enormous stretch of the American Southwest. So, what should residents and visitors actually take away from this pattern of collapse and rebuild that's defined Las Vegas's summer? First, that a break in the heat doesn't automatically mean a break in the danger. The exact days immediately following an extreme heat event, when parched ground meets sudden heavy rainfall, deserve just as much caution as the heat wave itself, particularly around washes, low-lying roadways, and any terrain downhill from higher elevation storm activity. For visitors unfamiliar with desert weather patterns in particular, the whiplash between extremes can be genuinely disorienting. A tourist arriving expecting nothing but dry, sunny skies might reasonably assume a thunderstorm poses little threat compared to the heat they braced for, when in reality the flooding risk immediately following a heat wave can be just as dangerous, if not more, immediately lethal than the heat itself, simply because it strikes so much faster and with so much less visible warning. Second, that this pattern is very likely to repeat, with forecasters already tracking the next westward expansion of this same high-pressure ridge heading into early September. The relief Las Vegas is experiencing right now should be treated as a pause rather than an ending. Residents who let their guard down after one heat wave breaks risk being caught off guard when the next one inevitably builds back in behind it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update the moment this pattern shifts again, because based on how this entire summer has unfolded in Las Vegas and across the broader American Southwest, one collapse has consistently meant another buildup is already forming close behind it. We'll keep tracking this cycle as it continues, straight from the forecasters and flood officials watching it develop in real time. For now, Las Vegas gets a brief window to catch its breath, cooling stations quieting down, storm drains doing their job, and residents finally getting a night where the temperature actually drops enough to sleep comfortably. But scientists studying this pattern aren't calling it over. They're calling it a pause in a cycle that's shown no real sign of breaking, one that's likely to test this desert city's resilience again before autumn finally settles in for good. Whether that next test arrives in the form of another triple-digit stretch, another round of sudden flash flooding, or some combination of both is exactly the kind of question forecasters watching this pattern will keep answering week by week for the rest of the season.